Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back to ancient Rome, a place where torture was not just an act of violence, but an integral part of the social fabric. Imagine the sun burning down on the stones of the Colosseum, the distant murmur of the crowd, and the quiet moments that preceded what we now associate with unimaginable suffering. You probably won't survive this. Well, at least not without a few scars of your own. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Rome is famous for its gladiators, its grand architecture, and its military prowess. But behind the allure of Roman grandeur was a deeply embedded system of punishment, a system that ranged from public spectacles to silent, invisible tortures. While the screams and bloodshed of the arena captured public attention, some of Rome's most effective and terrifying methods of punishment occurred quietly behind the scenes. These tortures weren't just about causing physical pain, they were about control, power, and maintaining a rigid social order. Despite what the movies and history books might tell you, torture in ancient Rome wasn't always loud or dramatic. Many methods were subtle, slow, and designed to break the spirit before they broke the body. The sounds of a Roman punishment might have been almost imperceptible, yet the psychological weight could be overwhelming. But why this quiet brutality? Let's begin by understanding how deeply woven torture was into Roman society, and why it was so widely accepted in their pursuit of justice. When you think of ancient Rome, it's easy to imagine towering marble buildings, massive stone roads, and the spectacle of gladiators fighting to the death. What's often left out of this picture is the insidious role that torture played in the daily lives of Roman citizens. In Rome, punishment wasn't just about dealing with criminals. It was a means of enforcing a rigid social order. From slaves to soldiers, from citizens to foreigners, the methods used to control behavior were diverse, brutal, and, as we'll see, often silent. Roman society was built on a strict hierarchy. Punishment and torture were woven into its very fabric, functioning as a constant reminder of who held power and who did not. The state used torture to reinforce control over its people, a concept still echoed in modern-day authoritarian regimes. Whether it was the well-known spectacle of crucifixion or the lesser-known but equally harrowing methods, the Romans believed that visible punishment had a vital social function: deterrence. However, it wasn't just about scaring the public. In many cases, the torture was designed to be quiet, subtle, and invasive, a creeping presence that did more than physically harm. It stripped away a person's identity, their dignity, and their sense of safety. Historians still argue whether the Romans' widespread use of torture was a result of their military nature, or if it stemmed from a cultural obsession with dominance and control. What's certain is that Roman law was harsh. Crimes, no matter how minor, often resulted in incredibly severe consequences. In the case of soldiers, especially, punishment was meant to be public. Yet the most common forms of discipline, like flogging or the fustuarium, were eerily silent compared to the loud spectacles we've come to associate with Roman cruelty. One of the more curious aspects of Roman punishment was how often the methods were designed to be internalized. This wasn't just physical pain, but a constant psychological torment that could leave no marks but cause an excruciating sense of helplessness. Imagine being subjected to the subtlety of the fustuarium, where soldiers could be beaten and punished in an almost invisible way. Not as dramatic as the gladiatorial games or the spectacle of crucifixions, but perhaps just as brutal in its own quiet, unrelenting fashion. Now, let's take a step into the more chilling side of Roman military discipline, particularly with the fustuarium, a form of punishment so subtle that you might not even realize what's happening until it's too late. The fustuarium was a form of execution or punishment reserved for soldiers who had shown cowardice or had committed certain offenses. In this method, the soldier's punishment was carried out in front of his fellow comrades, often quietly and without much fanfare. The soldier would be beaten to death, usually with sticks or cudgels, by his fellow soldiers. No grand speeches, no cheering crowds, just the rhythmic sound of wood striking flesh. What's unsettling about the fustuarium is its quiet execution. The victim would be surrounded by his peers, all part of a highly disciplined military group, and then forced to endure this method of punishment. The silent nature of the fustuarium made it a particularly effective way to instill fear and compliance among soldiers. The idea wasn't necessarily to entertain or to show off power. It was about creating a deep psychological impact on the individual and the group. The silent execution of punishment like this was designed to not only break the victim physically, but also strip away any sense of personal dignity. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind the fustuarium, but one theory suggests it was a way of maintaining the integrity of the Roman army. The punishment served to remind the soldiers that loyalty and bravery were paramount. Any sign of weakness would be met with this brutal and quiet end. The Romans didn't just want to punish, they wanted to prevent even the thought of disobedience from taking root. And in this silence, the fustuarium achieved its goal. It humiliated its victims and instilled fear in those who watched. Perhaps the most chilling part of the fustuarium was how it normalized the idea of betrayal and discipline within the Roman military. It wasn't about causing a scene. It was about creating an atmosphere where even the quietest punishment was feared and respected. It speaks to the power the Romans held over their people. Punishment could be swift, silent, and utterly final. As we move from the fustuarium to one of the most infamous forms of punishment in ancient Rome, crucifixion, it's important to understand that the event itself wasn't always as loud and dramatic as Hollywood movies would have you believe. Crucifixion, though often associated with agonizing screams and public spectacle, had a quieter, more psychological element to it than we often recognize. The practice of crucifixion was intended to be a slow, painful death. But the punishment was far more than just physical pain. It was also about the psychological effect it had on the population. The victim, usually a criminal or slave, would be nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to die over the course of several days. During this time, the condemned person was not merely enduring physical torment, but also facing a psychological collapse that came with the sheer isolation and hopelessness of the situation. In many cases, crucifixion was done in public to make an example of the criminal, but there were instances where it occurred in silence, far from the bustling crowds, making it an experience that was not only agonizing physically, but deeply soul-crushing as well. In the quieter moments of crucifixion, there were no cries of anger or defiance. Instead, there was the long, drawn-out suffering, which often involved slow dehydration, blood loss, and a gradual shutting down of the body's systems. It's hard to imagine a more subdued way for someone to endure death. While some might scream for mercy or struggle against their restraints, many crucifixion victims simply succumbed in silence, either too weak to make noise or too resigned to fight back. The Roman authorities didn't need to hear screams to know their punishment had succeeded. The silence of a slow death told them everything they needed to know. The victim had been broken, utterly crushed, in both body and spirit. Historians still argue whether crucifixion was designed purely as a spectacle for the masses or as an unspoken lesson to everyone involved. Some claim it was a method of social control, ensuring the masses understood that defiance against Rome could result in the most agonizing, humiliating death. Others argue it was a more personal form of punishment, designed to break the individual in ways that words or public executions never could. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, an effective, quiet method of power consolidation through fear, isolation, and time. What makes crucifixion so interesting in the context of quiet torture is its almost passive nature. Yes, there were screams, but they were the exception, not the rule. The victim's suffering wasn't designed to be loud. It was meant to be prolonged, a slow march to the inevitable, a quiet torment that echoed in the minds of those who witnessed it, far more than in the cries of the victim. From the public spectacle of crucifixion, let's now shift to a punishment that, while quieter in execution, was no less painful in its method: the scourging, or flagellation, used in ancient Rome. While most people imagine whipping or flogging as loud, dramatic events, Roman scourging often took place in an eerie silence that amplified the psychological torment of the victim. The scourge was a simple yet deeply effective instrument of punishment, typically made of leather strips, sometimes weighted with metal or bone to increase the damage. It was often used as a prelude to other punishments, crucifixion or execution. But even as a standalone punishment, it was a cruel, silent ordeal. The process of scourging was methodical. A victim would be stripped, tied to a pillar or post, and then lashed repeatedly across the back, buttocks, or legs. The stripes, often inflicted by multiple executioners working in tandem, could tear through the skin, exposing muscle and tissue. Despite the physical damage being clearly visible, the act itself was done in relative silence, save for the soft thwack of the leather against flesh. It wasn't designed to cause an immediate, chaotic uproar. Instead, it was meant to break the victim's spirit over time. Each strike was a silent reminder that the victim was powerless, forced to endure with little recourse. In Roman society, scourging was often used as a form of punishment for those who had committed crimes such as theft, insubordination, or even challenging the authority of the emperor. It was a punishment that carried no immediate hope of escape. It was drawn out, methodical, and painfully deliberate. What made the scourging particularly insidious, however, was its quiet nature. Unlike the showy executions in the arena, the silence of the scourging process spoke volumes about the efficiency and the emotional toll it took on both the victim and the audience. The victim's suffering became internalized. There were no screams to rally against or rally behind, just a relentless, rhythmic beating that could last anywhere from a few minutes to much longer. Historians still debate how widespread the practice of scourging was in Rome, with some suggesting it was used sparingly, while others argue it was a more common form of punishment than we generally recognize. The Roman legal system was complex and often inconsistent, so the application of scourging was left up to individual magistrates who had discretion in its use. Some scholars argue that the practice was used as a way to reassert Roman power in the provinces, where the empire's rule might have been less firmly established. One of the strangest aspects of Roman scourging was how it blurred the line between punishment and ritual. The act itself often became a ceremonial performance of sorts, meant to remind the punished of their place within Roman society. It was a method of submission, as much a form of public humiliation as physical punishment. Though not always seen as a grand spectacle, its subdued nature made it just as effective, if not more so, in psychologically breaking down those subjected to it. Let's take a pause from the whips and chains of physical punishment to explore a more subtle form of Roman torture: water-based punishments. While we often think of water as a symbol of life and cleansing, in ancient Rome, it could also become a tool of slow, quiet torture. One of the most bizarre and quiet forms of water torture involved a method called the dripping water technique, which, on the surface, seems innocuous until you understand its purpose. The technique was simple. Water would be dripped steadily onto the victim's forehead or scalp, often over a prolonged period. The victim would be strapped down, unable to move or escape, and this small, seemingly inconsequential action would slowly drive them insane. The torment lay in the fact that the victim couldn't control the dripping. It was incessant, rhythmic, and relentless. The sounds of the drops, echoing in the stillness, became a slow, maddening percussion that would infiltrate the mind over time. What makes this form of punishment particularly disturbing is that it wasn't physically painful in the traditional sense. It was psychologically tormenting, designed to break the will of the victim. The silent nature of water torture was deliberate. There was no loud drama, no cries for mercy. It was a quiet, almost meditative kind of suffering. It took place in isolated, quiet rooms, often far from the prying eyes of the public, adding an extra layer of psychological pressure. Imagine being alone in a dimly lit room, hearing only the sound of water, drop by drop, as it falls onto your skin. It's easy to dismiss the discomfort of a single drop, but over hours, days, or weeks, the relentless repetition can drive a person to madness. In the Roman worldview, this was an effective tool of punishment because it didn't just break the body, it also shattered the mind, leaving the victim in a fragile mental state where escape or resistance felt impossible. Historians still argue about the actual prevalence of water-based tortures in Roman times, as many records of such practices are ambiguous or lost to time. Some scholars believe that this technique was more widely used in the Roman provinces, particularly for slaves or prisoners of war, as a way of exerting power and asserting dominance in less public ways. Others suggest it was a rare form of punishment reserved for those deemed particularly dangerous or troublesome. But one thing is clear: when it came to Roman punishment, quiet methods were often the most effective because they were drawn out, leaving room for psychological breakdowns that the loud and brutal punishments couldn't achieve. In the end, the quiet nature of the water torture reflects a key theme of Roman punishment. It wasn't just about physical violence, it was about control, about breaking the spirit before the body ever gave out. It's a lesson in how the Romans used the silence to amplify the pain, making the experience all the more unsettling for those who endured it. Shifting gears from water torture, let's explore another relatively quiet method of punishment employed by the Romans: strangulation. While strangling might seem like a swift, violent act, in ancient Rome, it was often a method reserved for the more private executions, far from the brutal, public spectacles that marked other forms of punishment. The most common method of Roman strangulation was by hanging or using a simple noose, and the execution was carried out in silence. The victim would be bound, and a cord would be tightened around the neck, cutting off their air supply. Unlike the loud, frantic struggle of someone being beaten or pierced, strangulation was a method of execution that often resulted in a stillness that made the death all the more eerie. The process wasn't swift. It was a slow, suffocating death, where the victim's consciousness would fade slowly as the oxygen was drained from their body. While the Romans were no strangers to loud and violent forms of punishment, strangulation was quieter, with only the occasional gasp or muffled sound escaping the victim. The silence of this form of punishment was chilling, and for the people who witnessed it, it could be even more unsettling than the cries of a public execution. Strangulation wasn't just a private execution method. It was often the tool of choice for political dissidents, slaves who had dared to revolt, and those who were seen as a serious threat to Roman authority. The practice of strangulation, in many ways, reflects a desire to remove the victim not just from life, but from society entirely. In this silence, the victim was erased, not through the violence of a sword, but through the quiet suffocation of the self. Historians still debate the broader use of strangulation in Roman executions. Some believe it was a preferred method for those who had committed particularly heinous crimes but were not publicly executed, possibly due to their social status. Others argue that it was used more frequently in the private sphere, like within the homes of wealthy Roman families, as a method of disposing of inconvenient slaves or disgraced family members without causing a stir. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Strangulation was not the method of choice for public executions, but it was certainly more common than we might assume for those executed in secrecy. In a way, the quiet nature of strangulation made it an ideal tool for the Romans. It wasn't just the act of taking a life, it was the act of erasing someone without fanfare, in complete silence. The method itself seemed almost clinical in comparison to the public executions or gladiatorial contests the Romans are better known for. This quiet execution, executed behind closed doors, was a reminder of just how much power the empire had over its people. The ultimate fate of a person could be sealed in a moment of stillness, where there was no struggle, no outcry, just the quiet, deliberate taking of life. Now that we've explored some of the quietest forms of execution, let's turn our attention to another unique, less well-known method of Roman torture: the rat cage. This method was both devious and eerily silent, a form of punishment that left no marks but inflicted an immense amount of terror. The rat cage was a particularly horrific form of torture, used mostly in the later stages of the Roman Empire, where prisoners or slaves were subjected to this cruel method in order to break their spirits in ways that could not be measured by physical pain alone. The victim would be placed inside a small cage, sometimes no bigger than a large barrel, and a rat would be introduced inside. However, this rat wasn't simply left alone. It was often placed in direct contact with the victim's body, where the animal could burrow into the skin, gnaw on flesh, or crawl up the body in search of warmth. While the rat gnawed away, it created an ever-present sense of dread. This torturous device was, on its surface, relatively quiet. There were no whips or screams, just the almost imperceptible sound of scratching and gnawing that would become more and more unbearable as time went on. The silent, constant presence of the rat's movements would begin to mentally unravel the victim. What made the rat cage so terrifying wasn't necessarily the physical pain inflicted by the rat itself, but the psychological toll it took. The victim was trapped, isolated, unable to escape the constant creeping sensation of being gnawed at from within. Historians are still unsure about how widely this method was used, as records are scarce and often exaggerated. Some suggest that it was reserved for the most severe cases, particularly for those who had committed grave offenses against the state, while others argue that it was a more common, albeit secretive, method used in the darker corners of Roman prisons. What we do know, however, is that the rat cage inflicted suffering in a manner that transcended the physical. The victim was left alone with their terror, and as the minutes stretched into hours, then days, the isolation and helplessness became almost more unbearable than the physical torment. It was an exquisite cruelty, a slow, psychological breakdown that eroded the mind long before the body. The silence of the experience, broken only by the faint scratching of claws, amplified the horror, making it not just a torturous ordeal, but a lingering nightmare that invaded the victim's every thought. Historians debate whether this particular form of torture was actually practiced or simply a gruesome legend that grew out of the darker corners of Roman punishment. Some believe that it was an invention of later periods, used to exaggerate the cruelty of the empire. Others argue that it was a particularly effective method for breaking the will of those who were imprisoned for political reasons or who were viewed as expendable by the state. In either case, the quiet terror of the rat cage represents a stark contrast to the more traditional, violent forms of punishment we often associate with ancient Rome. Another form of punishment that remains surprisingly quiet in the annals of Roman history is the infamous damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This method of execution involved throwing a condemned individual into the arena, where they were often torn apart by wild animals such as lions, tigers, and bears. While the execution itself would often take place in front of roaring crowds, there was a less public, almost silent aspect to the preparation and final moments of this torturous fate. Before the condemned were brought into the arena, they often faced a psychological ordeal that was far more drawn out and quiet than the spectacle the crowds would witness. Imprisoned in cells beneath the Colosseum, prisoners awaiting damnatio ad bestias were subjected to weeks or even months of isolation. The psychological torment of awaiting an inevitable, violent death was as much a part of the punishment as the actual fight in the arena. The quiet waiting, being surrounded by the sounds of distant footsteps, murmurs from the crowds above, and the occasional roar of a beast, was a different kind of torture. The anticipation alone, the dreadful certainty of death approaching in silence, often caused more suffering than the animals themselves. Historians still argue over whether damnatio ad bestias was truly as widespread as we imagine. Was it reserved for criminals of high stature, or simply used to add flair to Roman spectacles? Some suggest it was a method used not only for execution, but also for public humiliation. Unlike gladiators, who were often trained for combat and could, in some cases, hope to survive and win fame, those condemned to die by beasts were usually completely unprepared. The silence of their fate, as they were led into the darkness of the underground cells, was a terrifying contrast to the boisterous gladiatorial games above them. It wasn't the bloodshed that mattered as much as the complete and utter hopelessness of their situation. For the public, the damnatio ad bestias might have appeared to be a loud and dramatic affair, filled with roars from the audience and vicious attacks from the animals. However, it's the quiet moments leading up to the event, where the condemned were often left alone with their fear and thoughts, that reveal the true psychological depth of this form of punishment. The fact that death could be slow and agonizing in its buildup, stretching the victim's anxiety to its breaking point, adds a layer of sinister quiet to the public spectacle. Unlike other forms of execution that involved crowds cheering and the visual shock of violence, damnatio ad bestias could be seen as a form of punishment that broke its victims down in silence long before they ever entered the arena. The waiting period in the dark, the steady sounds of an approaching doom, it was a quiet torture, a mental and emotional devastation that undermined the spirit long before the first animal pounced. Another eerie form of Roman punishment that's worth exploring is the breaking wheel, or rota fortunae, a method of execution that not only broke the victim physically, but also metaphorically shattered their identity in a chillingly silent manner. Unlike the dramatic and loud nature of some other Roman executions, the breaking wheel was a quieter, more methodical process. designed to extend the suffering of the victim through deliberate, measured pain. The victim would be bound to a large wheel, and their limbs would be broken, usually by blunt force trauma, before being left on display for public viewing. It wasn't the immediate pain that made this method so horrifying. It was the prolonged suffering and the mental agony of knowing the victim would remain alive for hours or even days in a public space. What set the breaking wheel apart from other methods was its strange Zoot symbolism. In Roman culture, the wheel was often seen as a representation of fate. Rota fortunae, the wheel of fortune, where your destiny could change with a simple spin. However, in the case of punishment, the wheel was an ironic metaphor for the victim's fall from grace. It wasn't just physical pain they endured, it was the destruction of their status, of their very identity. The wheel immobilized the victim, forcing them to be displayed as an object for public consumption. Unlike gladiators, who could be admired for their strength and courage, those who met their end by the wheel were reduced to a broken, silent form of spectacle. The method itself was done quietly, often in a relatively remote location, with no cheering crowds. The only sounds heard were the thudding blows to the victim's limbs and the victim's labored breathing. The audience might be distant, their interest piqued by the execution itself, but the suffering was far more personal than what the public ever saw. The victim's suffering wasn't meant to evoke immediate sympathy. It was meant to elicit fear, to remind the populace of what happened when one fell from favor or defied Roman authority. And while the victim could be left to die slowly, sometimes they would survive for hours, even days, suffering under the gaze of Roman citizens. The extended nature of their suffering, often quiet, isolated, and agonizing, left an indelible mark on the collective Roman psyche. Historians debate whether the breaking wheel was used extensively in Rome or whether it became more popular in the centuries that followed, during the medieval period. Some scholars suggest that the Roman version was not as widespread as other public executions like crucifixion, though others argue that the wheel was just as much a part of the Roman punishment system as any other method. What's clear is that the quiet nature of the breaking wheel's torment, its prolonged suffering and drawn-out pain, was a form of punishment that left lasting scars not only on the victim, but also on the public consciousness. The victim's silent endurance was the real punishment, as it reinforced the idea that defying Roman authority could result in a fate worse than death. Moving on from the harsh reality of the breaking wheel, let's now take a look at a more intimate, quieter form of execution that involved cutting or slicing. In ancient Rome, this punishment, though subtle in its execution, was no less brutal in its effect. The act of slicing was typically performed in a methodical, quiet manner, often using sharp blades or daggers to inflict pain slowly and deliberately. Unlike other more dramatic forms of execution, like beheading or crucifixion, slicing was a silent, drawn-out form of punishment that allowed the executioner to control the pace of the victim's suffering. The most notorious form of this method was sectio, where a victim's flesh would be cut in a precise, agonizing manner, often starting with small slices that were meant to disorient the victim and induce a sense of helplessness. The quiet nature of slicing, the lack of outcry or struggle, as the victim could often be too weak or resigned to resist, made this method particularly terrifying. It wasn't just about physical pain. It was about surrendering control, about feeling each incision and knowing that there was no escape. The victim might remain conscious for a long time, enduring each slow cut in the silence of their own thoughts, with nothing but the soft sound of the blade and their labored breathing filling the space. This form of punishment was often used in a personal, one-on-one setting, unlike public executions. It could be performed in the privacy of a home or in secret locations, where only the victim and executioner would be present. There was no audience to witness the slow and agonizing progression of the victim's suffering. This silence amplified the terror of the punishment. The victim's screams would be muffled, and they were left to confront their fate alone, surrounded only by the sounds of the blade against flesh and the quiet, oppressive atmosphere of their isolation. Historians still debate whether slicing was a commonly used form of punishment, or if it was more a rare, secretive method employed for political or personal reasons. Some scholars suggest it was used as a form of torture, often as a means of breaking prisoners or enemies of the state without causing immediate death. Others believe it was more ritualistic, used by the elites to assert control over their slaves or political rivals in a slow, almost ceremonial manner. Regardless of its frequency, the method was quiet, insidious, and deeply psychologically distressing. What made this method of punishment particularly effective was its ability to draw out the suffering. It wasn't just the pain of the initial cut. It was the mental toll of knowing each slice would bring more agony. The silence of the punishment amplified the psychological strain, as the victim was forced to endure this form of quiet torture alone, with no one to hear their cries or share in their suffering. As we've seen in previous methods, Roman torture wasn't always about loud, gory spectacles. It was often about subtlety, about drawing out suffering in ways that were almost impossible to perceive on the surface. One of the more insidious forms of Roman torture came in the form of imprisonment, specifically the psychological torment that prisoners experienced in the infamous Roman dungeons. The carceres, or Roman jails, were far more than simple holding cells. They were places where both the mind and body were tortured in silence. Inside these dark, damp prisons, prisoners weren't always subjected to the traditional forms of violent punishment. In fact, many were left to rot in silence, without any physical torture. But the psychological toll of imprisonment in these conditions was profound. The cells were small, dark, and filled with the sounds of water dripping from the stone walls or the occasional clink of chains. The very isolation of the carceres could drive men and women to madness. The slow, steady passage of time, with no one to talk to and nothing to do but wait, created a mental pressure that was more unbearable than any physical pain. What makes Roman imprisonment so intriguing, especially compared to more visible forms of torture, is that it was often a quiet punishment. The slow erosion of hope was the real torment. For many prisoners, the dread of never knowing if or when they would be released was worse than any whipping or flogging they might have endured. Imagine being trapped in a small, dark cell, the silence only broken by the occasional murmur of your fellow prisoners or the distant footsteps of guards. The quiet monotony of prison life was designed to break down the spirit over time. The lack of communication, the total isolation, and the ever-present threat of violence created an environment that was far worse than any noisy execution. Historians still debate the true conditions of Roman prisons. Some argue that they were often used for political prisoners or those who had been defeated in battle, while others suggest that Roman jails were used as a more general tool of punishment, a place for debtors, thieves, and criminals. The Roman approach to imprisonment was a stark contrast to what we think of today. There were no lavish meals or reforms. Prisoners were left alone with their thoughts and their fears, and in this silence, they would slowly wither away. The psychological aspect of Roman imprisonment was a form of quiet torture in its own right. The mental breakdown of prisoners wasn't marked by screams or struggles. It was marked by resignation. Over time, The mind would degrade, the will would diminish, and the body would follow. This silent breakdown could take weeks or months, with the victim fading into despair, quietly becoming a shadow of their former self. What makes Roman imprisonment so unique is that it wasn't about inflicting pain. It was about withholding all sense of relief, allowing the victim's own mind to become the torturer. Now that we've seen how imprisonment in Rome could break a person's spirit without a single whip or blow, let's shift our focus to another form of silent torture that preyed on the psyche rather than the body: the mistreatment and punishment of slaves. In ancient Rome, slaves were often subjected to brutal, quiet forms of punishment that were designed to reinforce their subjugation without the need for public displays of violence. Unlike gladiators, who had some chance of survival and glory, slaves were frequently the victims of psychological torment that happened behind closed doors. These forms of punishment could be subtle, almost invisible to anyone not directly involved, but they were no less cruel. One of the most insidious forms of slave punishment was the decimation, a practice primarily used to punish entire groups of soldiers, but it also found its way into the treatment of slaves, especially in the aftermath of rebellions or disobedience. The term decimation means to take out 1 in every 10, and it was usually carried out by forcing the remaining slaves to choose among themselves who would be executed. This form of punishment was eerily silent in the way it was carried out. There was no loud battle, no dramatic execution scene. Instead, it involved quiet whispers, decisions made under duress, and a growing sense of dread that infected the whole group. The silence of decimation, the fact that those sentenced to die weren't always immediately executed, but had to wait in limbo, was just as agonizing as the punishment itself. Another method of punishment for slaves involved simple but effective methods of deprivation. Slaves who disobeyed their masters could be subjected to extended periods of starvation or confinement, often without a clear sense of when the punishment would end. This psychological torture could go on for days or even weeks, as the victim waited in quiet desperation, unsure of whether or not they would survive the ordeal. Without physical marks to show the extent of their suffering, these forms of punishment were difficult to detect, but they had a devastating effect on the slave's mental health. Over time, a victim subjected to such silent forms of punishment could break down mentally, unable to endure the uncertainty and deprivation any longer. Historians still debate the extent to which Roman masters used these quiet forms of punishment, especially in the context of large estates or in urban settings. Some argue that these subtle tortures were more common in the homes of the elite, where slaves were treated as property and punishment was often invisible to outsiders. Others believe that these methods were used as a matter of routine, and that the psychological toll was often more devastating than physical pain. What's clear is that these forms of quiet punishment were designed not only to break the body, but to strip away the slave's sense of identity and autonomy. The real pain came not from the blows themselves, but from the constant awareness that their fate was controlled by others, that their very existence could be erased in silence. Slavery in ancient Rome wasn't just about physical torment. It was about stripping away the humanity of those enslaved, often in ways that were invisible and silent. The quiet, ongoing torment that many slaves experienced, whether through decimation or deprivation, was a constant reminder of the complete and utter control that Roman society held over the lives of those it enslaved. These subtle methods of punishment served to reinforce the power dynamics of Roman life, making the very act of existing as a slave a quiet, ongoing form of torture in itself. While we've explored a range of silent, insidious punishments, it's important to consider how the Roman Empire justified such cruel methods of torture. It's often said that Roman society viewed punishment as a form of social order, a necessary evil to maintain the peace and cohesion of the empire. But what is fascinating is how Romans philosophically and culturally justified torture, especially those quieter, more subtle methods that have often been overlooked in historical accounts. Punishment for the Romans wasn't always about causing visible, dramatic suffering. It was about maintaining control, imposing discipline, and ensuring that the social order was not disturbed. Roman thinkers and lawmakers often viewed punishment as a means of both public deterrence and personal reform. Yet, despite the seemingly benevolent intention behind these practices, the reality was far harsher. For instance, punishment for slaves or soldiers was about breaking their will, a quiet and methodical process that had more to do with psychological dominance than physical pain. The Roman ideal was that pain and suffering should be internalized, almost like a private battle between the condemned and their own mind. If they could endure the silence of torture without breaking, they would emerge stronger. If not, they would be erased. Historians still argue whether these forms of quiet punishment were truly aimed at reforming behavior or simply consolidating power. Some believe that the Romans were deeply influenced by their military backgrounds, where discipline was the cornerstone of society. They often used torture not only as punishment, but as a reminder of what could happen to anyone who stepped out of line. Others contend that torture, especially the more silent forms, was designed to humiliate and strip the individual of their dignity, ultimately turning them into an object of control rather than a person. For the Romans, the question of whether punishment was cruel or just didn't seem to matter as much as the question of whether it was effective. Was a person punished because they deserved it, or because society needed to be reminded of the consequences of stepping outside the lines? In the case of methods like the rat cage, strangulation, or the silent psychological isolation in Roman dungeons, the punishment was not just about extracting confession or retribution. It was about establishing a firm social order where the individual had no choice but to obey, even if it meant enduring a quiet death of the mind. What's fascinating, too, is the relative invisibility of these punishments in historical records. While grand spectacles like gladiatorial games, public executions, and chariot races were well documented, the quiet, drawn-out tortures were often lost to history. The fact that Roman authorities preferred these methods, which didn't stir up as much attention or outrage, reveals the empire's deeply ingrained desire for control. Control not just over bodies, but over minds. And when a person could be made to suffer in silence, to slowly break under the weight of isolation or subtle torment, they were rendered even more powerless than if they had been subjected to a more brutal, overt form of punishment. Historians still debate the role of these quieter forms of punishment in Roman culture. Was the Roman Empire uniquely cruel in this regard? Or did other ancient civilizations also rely on similar silent tortures? And how much of this psychological cruelty was a reflection of Roman societal values that prioritized order, discipline, and control above all else? Regardless of the answers, one thing is clear: the silent, psychological tortures of ancient Rome remain some of the most unsettling methods ever employed by any empire. As we approach the end of our journey through the silent tortures of ancient Rome, it's important to reflect on the long-lasting effects these methods had, not only on those who endured them, but on the empire as a whole. Roman torture, with its quiet, drawn-out nature, wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about shaping a society that was ruled by fear and order. While the loud spectacles of gladiatorial combat or crucifixion might have captured the attention of the masses, the quieter, more insidious forms of punishment were just as effective, if not more so, in reinforcing the empire's grip on power. The impact of silent tortures like the fustuarium, the rat cage, or even the psychological torment of Roman imprisonment can still be felt today. These methods didn't just break bodies, they destroyed identities. They were designed to reduce the individual to nothing more than a tool for Roman control, their willpower and humanity stripped away through isolation, fear, and mental breakdown. The quiet, insidious nature of these tortures ensured that the victim's suffering was private, often leaving no physical scars, but creating long-lasting emotional and psychological damage. But beyond the individuals who suffered under these methods, the society that created such practices was also deeply affected. The Romans built an empire based on the principles of discipline, control, and a rigid hierarchy. While the empire thrived for centuries, it was also plagued by internal strife, rebellions, and corruption. The very methods used to maintain order, silent psychological tortures, created a society in which people were constantly reminded of their fragility and powerlessness. In a way, the Romans' reliance on these methods of punishment reflected the deep instability that lay beneath the surface of their empire. It was a society where the threat of silent, unseen suffering kept everyone in line. But at what cost? Historians often look back at the Roman Empire as an example of both grandeur and cruelty. They admire its achievements in law, governance, and military prowess, but they also acknowledge the brutality that underpinned much of its success. The silent methods of punishment we've explored tonight are a testament to that cruelty, a cruelty that was designed not to shock or horrify, but to quietly control, break, and erase. These methods allowed the Romans to maintain order in a vast empire, but they also sowed the seeds of suffering that would reverberate throughout history. As you drift off into sleep tonight, imagine the silent suffering of those who lived under such a system. The slow, invisible toll it took on their bodies and minds, the weight of their isolation, the constant fear of punishment that hovered just beneath the surface. But also remember, as the night quiets around you, that even in their suffering, these victims played a role in the shaping of an empire. An empire that ultimately fell, not just because of its enemies, but because of the very systems of control and torture that had once held it together. Now, let yourself unwind. Let go of the ancient cruelties we've explored, and focus instead on the peace of the present. As the world outside fades into stillness, remember that the pain of the past doesn't have to carry forward. The quiet of the night, the hum of your surroundings, is all that's left. Let it soothe you into a restful sleep.